Here comes Goldman Sachs, and they take the risk, put the money in to solve this problem, and then you're saying, if the problem is solved, they get paid back. That's the problem is trying to solve others. Yes, sir.
So my first reaction, because I work in the general field, was, oh my goodness, this is really complicating things. And my second reaction was, first, it gives you capital to get started, because the government's saying, I only want to pay for success and outcomes.
Yeah.
So to expect a nonprofit to suddenly have the cash to do what they're doing, huge cash flow issues. The second thing I was thinking, actually, that's a plus, was we get business involved in a different way than just asking for fundraising. Maybe if they have more skin in the game, they'll appreciate the social problem more. That was just one of my thoughts, reading the article, after initially feeling like, why bother, why does it, And finally, government has these really bureaucratic things you have to go through as a rule, right, with contracts. So you need a project like this to get it unstuck.
Okay, so let's put the survey going. You bring the focus on the survey program, which will serve these kids. We like to call them beneficiaries, citizens, whatever. So this is the problem that ROCA is trying to solve. And technically speaking, this has to be the government's responsibility to take care of the citizens. And your point is, look, somebody has to give the money. So strictly speaking, the government has to be giving money to ROCA to take care of the funding of keeping these kids off the street, getting them employment, etc. However, they don't want to provide the money up front, and there is where you're going to private investment. You said a business, so we get the business involved. So the business comes in, puts in the money up front, right? So in this case, they put in something like $18 million up front. And so ROCA takes this money over a period of 4 to 6 years. They do the work, and you also added under the curve, you said performance and outcomes, right? So if the performance and outcomes turn out to be satisfactory, then what happens is the government kicks in. They say they do this stuff and they look for results. And if results come in, these are results, these are outcomes, this is the success. If that happens, then government turns around and pays back the funding. Okay, and the government goes back and government gets its return. So you're saying it gets business involved. It's good for. So how does business get involved other than just paying the money, the $18 million?
Well, they're taking the risk. That means they have to study it. They're going to be a much better partner, right? Because I think, as opposed to, let me give you a grant for $50,000. Let me give you a grant for $100,000. I think there's more skin in the game.
More skin in the game. The $8 million. So they're going to work with ROCA to absolutely make sure that those return arrows work. It's not just ROCA take the money as a grant, go spend it. So now they'll monitor, they'll bring the expertise, all this stuff, and then the results come, then the government pays them. That's what is happening. It's good for business. Business is taking the risk, they're getting involved. Any other observation on what's going on? Yes.
I just have a question as far as the trust fund that the government is paying out of. Is that something that is dependent on appropriations on an annual basis? Because if you're facing a contract 7 years out, you don't know what's going to happen in 7 years, who's going to be government, what the, what the nature is.
That is a fabulous question, and in fact, we will reserve that question for Molly. But there's one of the unique things that was done in Massachusetts. They established the trust fund exactly to avoid the problem. Exactly to avoid the problem, right? Because we don't know what the next administration is going to be. Is it going to be the same party, is it going to be Republican, is it going to be Democrat, what are the alignment of the stars, who is the governor, all this stuff. So you do this stuff and then 3 years later, different one says, oh, sorry, forget it, So this one, once you set up a trust fund, it's a done deal. It's a done deal, it's the law, recourse with the $50 million spot there, and they can pay. That gives investors a lot of confidence. But this is just a very high-level view, but the individual detail, we can come and ask more. Any other options? So this is what it's trying to do, right? Agree with that? So, yeah, go ahead.
So first, the most of the money is private, so we're boosting social impact with private money. For most, and second, we're basically we're reducing use of business strategies in NGOs.
great start.
better world.
I mean, there's an idea for the Harvard Business School, right? Business strategies come in, how to work with these kids, how to get them out, how to get them back in employment, how to prevent recidivism, and then, of course, business comes in. This is fantastic. Business is here to save the world and especially address a problem that the government has failed. And David told us in the morning speech, government is the ultimate IPO.
Yeah.
And here in I don't love David, IPO. And your government is failing in its job. That's why 65% of these kids go back to jail. That's why they go back to jail, right? And that's the problem. Okay, yes, sir.
So, outside of my environment here, I'm an HCAS student, and we discussed a case similar to this, and a very proud advocate of government said this is terrible because the government has a job, and we're taking away their ability to problem solve, both in the financial side and in the policy side. We're outsourcing that. So in terms of the immediate impact, and in terms of this narrow problem, we have found a solution, but in terms of the apparatus of government as an institution for solving social problems, we've now deprived it of a learning opportunity that could systematically improve it long term.
Greatest thing since sliced bread. That's what the first two speakers told us, right? They told us that it's business methods, it's business money, and then it is business discipline. They take the discipline. Now from the Kennedy School, our partners in the social ethics conference are saying it is terrible. I see you work together, the business school and the Kennedy School, we're absolutely joined at the hip, we're marching together. And I have a lot of students from the Kennedy School, so this is terrible stuff because the government is basically outsourcing, right? It's fundamental responsibility, and that's what government is supposed to do. They're supposed to give us a police force, they're supposed to maintain law and order, they're supposed to make sure that the kids get educated, they run the primary schools, they run the healthcare system. They're supposed to take each one of us and make us active, good, productive citizens. And if we sway from the path, they're supposed to come and help us out. Now what government is, sorry, I can't do this stuff. Outsource it. No, by the way, I don't even have money. Of course we collect taxes. Nobody knows what they do with the taxes. So they take the taxes and now say, I don't have the money. Please bring Goldman Sachs, private investors. It's a terrible thing in outsourcing. The government should be doing this. PF is not a great idea, but if all that thing works, the greatest thing is sliced bread. Yes, sir.
Traditionally, when you outsource is when someone else can do things better than you can. And I believe that in this case, the private sector is much better suited to solve these kinds of problems because of what people have to talk.
And the responsible government, at least here, admits that it's got a problem. Getting private sector, getting somebody else to do it is a pretty damn good thing. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just to I would kind of speak to the government kind of facing the realities of the situation. You just think about what government is composed of, and at this point it's composed of warring parties that are continuously just unable to make any constant decision. And so it's realization that, hey, we're not going to be able to fund programs like this sustainably, so we're going to incorporate the nonprofit and for-profit sector and utilize their strengths to get something done.
Yeah. So I think get some alignment going, get some productive results going. Yes, ma'am.
I think that one key piece of the problem that we haven't really talked about yet is the system's failure around testing, demonstrating proof of concept for social innovation, and then bringing it to scale. And I think that, to me, this pay for success model is specifically designed around that, and it's not either or. Government should do this, private sector should do this. It's about bridging across the sectors, which one of our speakers this morning talked about. Knitting them together, and the government really looking at how do we leverage private sector funds to take risks and test the proof of concepts, demonstrate that things that work. And the government absolutely is I think you call it IPO, right? Like, they're the ones who are going to be bringing it to scale when it works.
So one is the performance idea. The other one you're saying is it's really like, it's really transforming how we approach social problems in our society. And if in fact this model works, we can scale it. And it's not as though government is absolving itself of its responsibility. It's just a different model. So the private sector comes in, pays the upfront money. Government will repay the money. So it's not as though government keeps it. Because government not only repay the money, they will even pay them a return, right? If the job is done well, Goldman Sachs get $1 million in terms of bonus. They put in 9, they can end up getting 10 million. So the private sector get back. It's a different model. It might be a model for the future for solving a whole bunch of social problems that society faces. They get private enterprise money. So it's other good things. Transform society. But some people here feel it might not be a good thing. Government should be doing everything. 1 or 2 comments on that, and then I want to move on. Yes.
Well, yeah, on that comment in terms of outsourcing, it's fine to outsource if you have clear benchmarks that you can measure whether the private sector or the NGO is doing what it needs to do. The government already outsources things like garbage collection and electricity, like implementation. No one complains about their garbage collection being outsourced because there's clear benchmarks that you can tell the job is being done. So if this is a problem where we have clear metrics of what is the rate of recidivism, how many of these children are, graduating high school or getting their GEDs, if we have those clear benchmarks, then of course we should outsource it and just make sure those benchmarks are being met. If it's a more hazy problem like national security, then maybe we won't have those metrics, and that's what we don't want to outsource.
Clear, and what do you think? Are there clear metrics in this case? Is it like garbage collection, or is it
I think in this case there are clear metrics.
clear metrics?
Because you can look at if the problem is recidivism, you can measure that.
Yeah, you can measure it. There seems to be data, whether it's 50%, 65%, can you reduce it? Okay, so let's do this, right, in the interest of time. And also because we want to hear from Molly quite a bit, and also some of the other folks who already have familiarity with PFS, if there's time, we'll spend 5 to 10 minutes thinking about what it might lead to going forward. If I were to quickly ask for a show of hands, 2 kinds of arguments have been put forward. I think the dominant sentiment is it's a good thing. It is outsourcing, acknowledged, everybody in the government is outsourcing. But since we have a big social problem, it's a new way, new model. Private sector puts in the money, they carry the risk. If in fact the job is done, there are performance and clear metrics, then the government will pay back the money, we will put it away into a trust fund, therefore the private sector gets their money back, there'll be no political involvement. It's a new way of doing stuff. Let's try this because we have not solved this problem. It's generally a good thing. If that's the case, raise your hands. Okay, that's the majority, that's what I thought. And in spite of a very powerful argument.
It's not my personal view, but.
So that's right, so let's do this, right? I'm sure there are a lot of other things we can dig into, but let me push this forward a little bit, right? So what you folks have done is you have, let's take the actors that many of you have identified. Private sector. Many of you have identified private sector. In private sector, there is of course Goldman Sachs, which is investment money. But then of course, we can go down through the city. There are other foundations too, like Living Cities, Kellogg. You have the junior lenders. These folks have put in 9 million. The junior lenders have put in 3 million. And then of course your philanthropy too, the Arnold Foundation. Then of course, Vanessa Kirsch, you heard in the morning, New Profit Inc., Boston Foundation. So they have, between them, $6 million. This is the private, people that mention the private sector. Then of course, we will mention the government. People mention the government in terms of what their risk rewards are. What else? Okay, this is what we talk. So let's split them up. So here is Goldman Sachs and Living Cities. This is an investment from these foundations, and these are grants. These are grants. So let me ask you. 15%. Okay. So Molly, we gently reminding us, guys, you spent 25 minutes in the Harvard Business classroom, and I'm sitting right in front of you. And you folks have not even mentioned Roca so far. And Roca puts in considerable amount of this as well, because they have $3 million in this. So in lieu of services, if you notice, if those who read the case carefully, in lieu of services, they put that in as equity, because it costs them money. I mean, after all, to take care of 929 kids, put the youth workers on the street and all this stuff, it's not a costless thing. So that's $3 million. So ROCA has got $3 million in this. And that's how it adds up, right? So ROCA has got $3 million of equity. Let me ask you, now that we added ROCA, so we got government, we got ROCA, we got private sector investors, both in terms of for-profit like Goldman Sachs, and we've also got the non-profit like profit. Who has the highest risk among these four players? We have these four players. In terms of risk rewards, who do you think carries the largest risk? So I'm just sort of summarizing. This is a private investor, Goldman Sachs, Living Cities. Let me put Living Cities out here. This is one group. Then we have the foundations. And then we have the government, and we have local. Who do you think has the largest risk in this deal? ROCA?
No.
No. So let's hear, so no, ROCA. Why ROCA, Sarah?
Well, because their starting balance is low. They have all of these needs that these finances could go to in other areas. They have competing priorities, and their balance sheet is considerably smaller than all of those other players.
They're the smallest player. I mean, they're not bad. I mean, they have an annual budget of $8 million. $8 million is the bonus of quarterly bonus. I'm not talking about bonus. Quarterly bonus of the 300 partners of Goldman Sachs. Quarterly. If they do that, they get $8 million. And ROCA takes a whole year to get that. Okay. So ROCA has the highest risk. You said no. Who has the highest risk?
I think you've forgotten the beneficiaries as one of the issues that we might talk about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because if this incentivizes the wrong performance,
Yeah.
families lose, right?
Exactly. So it's sort of ROCAs and beneficiaries are sort of hand in glove, one can say. Like if this model fails, and as a result of this, either ROCA does not get the job done on the streets, or for some reason, if these kids don't get this kind of service, then they go back to jail for two and a half years. And they lose their life. I mean, not really going back to jail, but that's it. So they come by recidivism, and then they lead a life which is not very productive for them. It hurts society, but it also hurts them. And then the cycle repeats itself. The cycle repeats itself. So ROCA is at risk, the beneficiaries are at risk. Yes, sir.
Well, ROCA, not so much because of the money, but its reputation. Its inventiveness, its flexibility, its rapid change. Can they perform on those criteria? That would be the long-lasting criteria. Because what you're doing here in the essence is breaking the iron triangle of government money up first, to a traditional bureaucracy, to traditional methods. If this fails, the Goldman Sachs is going to go on other investments. ROCA is going to take the criticism. If it's a success, ROCA's got the greatest benefit here because of its flexibility, its inventiveness, and its ability for rapid change.
I see. So it's both the largest risk, but the greatest reward as well, right? And you're saying if it succeeds, the Goldman Sachs, if they get back 1 million of the 9, it's not a big deal, right?
100 of these investments.
Yeah, $1 million. Wow! They're not going to stand up on the rooftop and say, what a terrific investment we made.
Goldman Sachs is not going to change
ROCA,
public agencies, ROCA will.
ROCA, if in fact this works out, it enhances the reputation, but when it enhances reputation, what happens is, okay, come on, you took care of 929, let's say 1,000 kids, but there are 3,000 kids, just not 1,000.
Transferability.
Yeah,
Can it scale up?
so more folks come in and say, here's the money, get it done, and if Massachusetts does a great job, let's face it, it's not just a Massachusetts problem. Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, all of us have the same problem. So if it does this, it's reward, and if that reward happens for ROCA or ROCA-like organizations, there'll be other ROCAs, and then ultimately, the kids. The biggest beneficiary are these kids who then don't have to live this life. They get educated, they get mainstream, they get a transitional job, and then they go out and they're productive citizens. So the risk and reward is both at ROCA, you're saying. So by and large, do people agree that we started off by saying Goldman Sachs carries the risk, and now we're saying there's not much risk for them? Yes?
I would say that the Arnold Foundation, they don't have any reward, and at the same time, they still consider a large amount of risk because, you know, they're not getting any money from this, and they could be funding other programs, which could be giving, yeah, it's an opportunity cost for them, so they're gaining nothing, but, you know, it's a risky path.
Good point, good point. So let me just take a minute, right, because this is the way the graph looks. If you really plot the graph, this is the way it looks. This is the way it looks. So this is reduction in residence, and this is government savings. Okay? So if this was an MBA class, folks, you would be expected to have worked through the data and to actually have worked out and plotted the graph. You haven't done it, but this is how the graph will look like. Okay? So at about, this is say $22 million is the government saving, if you take a look at that, and this is the break even at about 40%. If ROCA reduces recidivism by 40%, the government saves $22 million and they pay out the $22 million. And that $22 million will be, Goldman Sachs get $9 billion plus 5% interest, Living Cities get $3 million. This is the way it turns out. And then if you add the service fee for ROCA, you add all this up, it turns out to be like $22 million they pay back. What happens if they do only 25%? What happens if ROCA works very, very hard, but a lot of things happening on the street. It's not an easy thing to do. I mean, and if it happens to reduce visibility by 25%, what happens? Take a look at the table, and let's just spend a minute on that. What happens at 25%?
11 million.
11 million, you're right. This is on page 10 of the page. This table right here, 11 million. Okay, so government said only 11 million. And if the government says only 11 million, they will pay 11 million out as success payments. And when they pay 11 million out as success payments, who gets the money first? Goldman Sachs. The institution with the biggest pockets, I mean, their pockets are bulging, they're down all the way up here. ROCA is the one that's got the slimmest, as you said, the balance sheet, everything started off. They got a huge pocket. So if it's only 11 million, they get the money first. Arnold Foundation, New Profit Inc., Boston Foundation, they're not even junior lenders. They are below, and even below them on the totem pole is ROCA. Right down there, right on. So ROCA gets its money last, right here. And then the foundations, then the junior lender, then the senior lender. So if they do only 25%, Goldman Sachs makes out like a bandit. They get, not like a bank, not a whole lot, they get the money back. So this is the way the curve works, right? So here Goldman Sachs bails out, the junior lender bails out, somewhere here the foundations get their money, and unless they do 40%, ROCA does not get its money. Their equity is money. So what happens after this point? You can complete the graph. What happens after this point? Do you know what happens here? So they don't pay out more than 22 million, or 27 million is the maximum. So what happens if ROCA goes out and does a fabulous job and reduces recidivism by 65%? What happens to all this money? Who gets that?
Government saves.
Government saves the money, right? If ROCA reduces recidivism 65%, the government savings in its coffers are ultimately 45 million, but they only have to pay out 27 million. And when they pay out 27 million, Arnold Foundation gets its money, all the nonprofits get their money, but they reinvest in something like this, but Goldman Sachs. That is the structure of the contract. Now that you know this, who carries the maximum risk? Local. No?
No, I meant no for government. Government doesn't take that risk.
Government doesn't take that risk, right? So government doesn't take the risk. So ROCA takes that risk, but the other folks are putting the money in, and if ROCA does not achieve the performance, then the government doesn't have to pay out. The private investors, they take the hit. The foundations and the grant makers might say, I do this anyway. That's what I do. I don't expect to get any money back. I'm solving a social problem. At least this is the method by which I can recoup it, if in fact. So let me ask you this question. Going back to the original observation. How do you now ensure that an organization like ROCA gets the job done?
You gotta be inventive, you gotta be flexible, they gotta be rapid change, they can't stay the path with the original game plan, because they can be focused on results, and results is based on the future.
So the question I'm asking is, do the folks from Goldman Sachs and the intermediaries like Third Sector and Arnold Foundation, do they come and tell Molly, this is what you should do it? I was a McKinsey consultant, here is the group. So how does it happen? How does ROCA get the job done?
I think it's by picking work, and you have to pick the right group in the first place, because there's nothing anyone could tell them. This is their core work. And then secondly, you build in some monitoring, and as the article said, there's some evaluation. So if there's problems early on, ROCA could get some problems starting brainstorming on the issue. But if it's not picking the right group in the first place, forget it. It doesn't, it's not going to work.
Why did they pick ROCA of all the institutions on the country?
Track record.
Track record?
Yeah.
I mean, ROCA has a track record. They've been doing this for 25, 30 years. They can show you they can reduce recidivism. I mean, here is an outstanding organization on the ground. They already get the job done. So you have to choose that. And because they show performance results, the government can end up saving anywhere from $22 million to $45 million in their cost. Now, the second question I want to ask you is, what happens to other social issues where you can't show the savings? Healthcare, you got a friend sitting there, right? So if you can't show the savings, education, if you can't show the savings, homelessness, if you can't show the savings, will your private investors come in with a white knight, come riding and say, here's the money, go save the social problem?
Yeah, you've got to find another Molly in those areas, somebody who's willing to have inventions and to have the criteria that would produce some kind of measurable effect.
Some kind of outcome. And you're saying
It's
the
not going to come
outcome.
from the investor, it's going to come from the activists on the ground level.
Okay, if the outcome is not in monetary terms, who will pay these investors back? That's the question I'm asking. Outcome is fine.
Same principle, right? The government's spending X dollars on education. It looks at, it may end up breaking even in some cases, but the value's in the outcome, better student results.
So the
Depends
outcome.
on the sector, depends
Good
on
point.
the.
But Leo, what you're saying is the outcome has to be somehow then boiled down to implicit savings for the government. You have to sort of somehow work out the savings. Education, you're absolutely right. Education might be more long-term, like, you put the kid through really good, maybe even Head Start education, or maybe
Yes.
K through 6, primary school, middle school, or whatever, you do the stuff, and therefore when this young person graduates from high school, they are well adapted, therefore the society saves a lot, and the product citizen, all that has to be calculated down, and then you get a private investor, okay, there's so much of say, then the government will pay. But if you're not able to boil it down to hard currency, then where does the payment come from?
I guess I think the payment can be government savings, but it can also be, the level of student debt and the sort of percentage of federal debt that people spend here is quite ridiculous. You can imagine a model where a private investor comes in, funds somebody's probably university education or something like that, and then for a certain period of time they take a percentage of their earnings. Maybe it's crazy, but
I see. I see.
and that reduces, and then they don't have the problem of federal student debt, and if they don't earn that much, well, that private investor's taking the risk. But getting a scholarship.
So new model, I think that's what you need, like a new model. If the savings do not reside with a government department or agency, as long as you can somehow show the saving, in this case, the saving is individual,
Yeah.
then you have to put together an intermediary who might collect from the student and then pay back. So a lot of interesting things can happen. But let me do this, right? We've been at it for like 40 minutes or so. We will get to some of these issues in terms of what happens in these circumstances. But let me turn you over to Molly. We need to hear from her, how she views this. She's heard it the first 40 minutes or so, we'll hear from her. And Molly, regardless of how you want to address it, please tell us what you do on the ground, what your youth workers do, how you work with this kids, how you get this terrific performance. So all that stuff, and then we can take Q&A. Molly, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here with you and with all of you. I'd ask you to join me for a minute in a moment of silence for Kenny Lamore. He's a young man in our program who was murdered, essentially executed on Wednesday morning during a break in a work crew. A remarkably tragic day for him and his family and for Roca. So I just ask for a minute of your time. And thank you to you for recognizing that the greatest risk actually is to the young men and to our communities, that far too many young men of color, poor young men, are dying way too young or going to prison for the rest of our lives, their lives. And so the price is the greatest there, although we don't tend to recognize that. And from our perspective, obviously, it's one of the most extraordinary opportunities and responsibilities of this social impact bond or pay for success, that this amount of money and attention and resources are being given to them. And it's our great privilege at Roca to not only work with these young men, but to be able to implement this project. So let me just tell you a little bit about Roca, what Roca does. I'll answer a few things that were sort of floating around, and then we'll just open it up for questions that are probably far more interesting. We have created an intervention model for what is known as very high-risk young men. And that means by high risk that their felony charges, they match risk assessments, that they're on track for future violence and incarceration as opposed to low-level crime. In Massachusetts, as Kash was saying, 65% of them go back to prison within 5 years for an average of 2.4 years, costing the Commonwealth $240 million. And that doesn't count future incarceration. So that's sort of the issue here. Can we, in fact, do something different for these young men? Not only because they need it, but our communities need it. So what Roca has done over the years, we did a lot of things, hope we did more good than bad. We really had no idea, to tell you the truth. And maybe 9 years ago, we did a lot of things. We were fairly well known. I hope we were doing more good than bad. But we looked around at our highest risk young men and really, brought young people to programming, committed to the youth development model, a fabulous framework, holistic development, what you want for your young people. And we realized that the highest risk young men would come to Roca and feel really good and do things, and then they'd go home and shoot people and deal drugs. And we're like, not the point. And so we kind of stopped things. We continued, but we sort of stopped things on another level and really looked around at the world going, we've got to find a better way, and looked at the stages of behavior change, which is very much the core of all the behavioral health work in the country, medicine, risk reduction, harm reduction, and really started to look at criminal justice literature and decided that we really need to learn about behavior change. So our model has 4 core components. The first we're sort of most known for, which is relentless outreach. We go after young people, we document it, we bang on their doors, we find their friends, their girlfriends, their mothers. We work with cops. We will do anything we can to find you and haul you into programming. At Roca, if you meet the criteria, high risk, age group, you don't have to want to be in the program. This is not a gee, I love you, because they pretty much hate us most of the time they're at Roca. It's our sort of famous sort of signature, if you will. And police officers and governments and professors and anybody else we think we need to know, they'll tell you we're relentless as well. The second thing is young people change in the context of a relationship. So our case management model is really a transformational relationship, and it's about engaging young people in a relationship to create a context for which they can change and build trust. We have a 1:25 ratio for the first 2 years of our model, and a 1:60 for the third and fourth year. So this is a 4-year intensive model. We don't care if you want to be here. So this is a long-term gig we got going on here. The next part really is, I like to call it the Get Your Life Together School. These young men really do not have skills to work. Their education skills are limited. Even if they're ready to get a high school diploma or a high school equivalency, they barely can sit still, you know, and their life skills are off. Their thinking is off, right? The whole sort of basis, if you will, for behavioral health is to learn to think different, to act different. That they have distorted thinking, that when they get angry, they cause harm, or they think, you know, shooting people is what you do, or you don't have to go to work, right? There's sort of a lot of fantasy about how, you know, if we just got them the right jobs, they would do great, and, you know, they really could be businessmen because they're all drug dealers. I can count on less than one hand in 27 years the number of young people who are that good at dealing drugs. And by the way, none of them really are in great shape mentally. So our young people do not know how to work. They have a hard time showing up, right? They're pissed off and they're angry. So what we had to do, they don't go to things. If they were ready, willing, and able to participate in an excellent training program, go to community college, keep a job, they should be there. Roca's not the place for them. Will actually cause more harm. The literature is really clear. Do not mix risk populations. Well, so what can we do? We can keep referring them to programs where they're going to blow up and fail. That doesn't feel so good. We could wait for them to have a vision or epiphany. That was not so successful. So we essentially have created this Get Your Life Together school for education and employment and a lot of life skills, a lot of behavioral health, trying to change people's thinking, that builds in the fact that we often have to haul them in, that they might come for 2 weeks and get pissed off and get high and leave and hate us, and then we have to drag them back in. They could start today and then stop tomorrow and then start again. They could threaten us, right? So a real clear example of this, we run transitional employment. They get paid real pay for real work, so it's minimum wage. They work 4 days a week and come to a development day, and it generally takes them 15 to 18 months to get 60 days in a row. This is really important. 60 days in a row, and I kind of think you ought to put 60 days in a row in before we send you to work for someone else, right? Because otherwise, not going to succeed. We're looking at about an 18 to 24-month period for sustained behavior change. And so the whole thing about Roca is really to keep engaging them, to get them to learn to think different, to act different, and to give them real-life opportunities to change and practice their behavior because they did not get it at another time in their life. Interestingly, we're really grateful for this. We sort of had a gut feeling. You know, there's more science now that there's some late-stage brain development here, you know, coming up to age 25. So that's literally what do we do most days? We go find people, we haul them out of bed, we love them, we fight with them, we argue with them, we haul them into programming. We have a few good days, then we have a lot of bad days, then we start again, and we go at it over and over again until the change starts to happen. The kind of end game, if you will, is getting them to reduce and eliminate the criminal behavior, right, and to get them to go to work. The former governor of Maryland, O'Malley, said there is no progress without a job, and I love that phrase. I steal it, I give him credit, I heard him say it. There is no progress without a job. And if you do not know how to work, which is hard to grasp for a lot of people, you've got to learn. And so that's really what this is about. The fourth component of our model is an engaged institution strategy. I kind of really think we should call it marrying institutions, but we go after police, governments, probation, criminal justice organizations, Department of Youth Services, employers, health organizations, everybody and anybody who are in these young people's lives, and build relationships so we can put a network around them and keep them safe and try to bring them in. And unfortunately, as we learned painfully this week again, it's not always possible, but it's really critical. Because when we are talking about young people who have guns and knives, right? So who else is out there with us? It's the police. And so we have to go through the same relentless outreach with those institutions. We have to build trust. We have to create transformative relationships, and we have to create learning opportunities in partnership with those organizations so that we can, in fact, build the muscle to work with these young people in a different way. We have to be gentle with each other. They help us be better, and in turn, I think we help them be better, and that's how we get the systemic change. So that's really the ROCA model. Young people in this project for Pay for Success are randomly assigned to us, so they literally hand us a list and go, here are your 50 kids this month, and there's a name and an address, and off we go. And we go knock on the door and go try to find young people, so that's what we do. So, couple things about ROCA that I think made us ready. The sort of wake-up call a while ago about what are we doing, we're not making change. We messed around with data, research. We've built an extraordinarily robust, ever-changing, performance-based management system. We track young people, we track staff, we do pattern analysis. We use data every single day. So, and for Pay for Success, for example, it's an automatic, pops out of the computer, gets emailed to the whole agency, who's on the referral list, how many young people are in, what everybody's done. So if somebody called up and said, you know, we got these 10 kids in Lynn, what are you doing? And they're on Cash's list. We can dig through our, like this. Well, Cash has gone to this house 5 times, met this kid 3 times, can't find this kid, but we've talked to his mother, and we can tell you that. So we started using data. We started to use metrics so that we could get better, most importantly, be worthy of the young people that we serve. So we're now in our 4th year of this 2-year intensive and 2-year follow-up of the model. And there's, I think, the other thing that I think Kash has shared, we didn't have access to administrative data. We couldn't actually count days of incarceration because we didn't have access to the system. I'll talk about that in a minute. But we did do an intensive look back at ROCA, and we showed a 65% reduction. So we think we have the capacity to meet the 40% and to do better. So I think that's what got us ready. I would like to think I'm responsible enough. Had we not been doing that I wouldn't have applied. I don't know, we all know, so I might have. But we shouldn't have gotten chosen if we had, you know. So, and just to sort of, before I get to the next piece, you know, it's just an immense privilege and responsibility, and we really try to carry ourselves that way with the young people and all our partners. A couple of things to say about this project. The government savings, the other key piece, right, is data, right? So I've shared with you the ROCA data, right? We're actually the strongest data player at the table. You know, we've spent, we're 1 year, a little over 1 year and 1 month into the project. We got up to about 300 young men in the project in the first year, which was pretty good. It was a little lower than we thought. We should have remembered this. I had to kind of remind people when we were in month like 10 why we hadn't finalized some data stuff. We have worked with 4 branches of government and 9 government institutions. Theoretically, with data that is easy to count. Right, we're not talking, tell me 10 years from now. Is this person incarcerated? How many days did we physically have custody over their body? Did this person get a job? What are the earnings, right, the UI data? So theoretically, that's easy. But, I mean, really, so the past year, I have to tell you, probably past 2 years, working through data sharing agreements, transparent data, transferable data. Most organizations, not just government, don't have good data. This can't work if the data isn't good, right? And so we're one of the earlier projects, we're the biggest project, so one would like to hope, and I think they're getting quicker, you know, we were bumping around a long time, but it's a key piece to this. And I think that, you know, it automatically starts to transform government because their data has to get transparent enough to be able to work with us. And so, and vice versa, we can return that. Couple things about evaluation. I'll talk about the trust fund and I'll be quiet and answer questions. So this project has 4 levels of evaluation. The way the contract reads is there's an independent evaluator, the Urban Institute, that does the random assignment and looks at the government data. How many days of imprisoned did the ROCA group serve versus the non-ROCA group? And remember, we're getting benchmarked 5 years later, right? There's also a public consulting group. It's a back-end validator. It's kind of like an auditor that comes and lifts up the foot of the car and checks things. And it's an evaluator behaving themselves. That's really, they're checking on the evaluator and the validity of that. All the interim data, every report, whether it's a daily question, whether it's a critical incident, whether it's a quarterly report, comes from our data system. I can tell you, we will know before anybody else if we're in trouble. There were these wild negotiations for the contract and exit triggers and remedies, and you know, I was like, we would never tolerate that level of failure. We're gonna know way before anybody else, right? But it's important, and we need to share that data. The other thing is Aroka is a 15% investor, which is unusual. It's actually a $3.6 million investment at 15%. And we're seeking to raise an additional $1 million, mostly for evaluation and a few one-time capacity costs, so that we can have an independent evaluator look at what is working. Because the government is, and that's fine, they only want to know if you're reducing days of incarceration, saving money. They're not particularly interested in what's working, right? Where we really feel like this is such an extraordinary both responsibility and opportunity, we better know that this is better that we're doing and this is dumb that we're doing, and do more of this and less of that. Last thing I'll just say is I do think what Governor Patrick, the former governor, and I'm confident the current governor is very interested in this, did that was really smart was a couple of things. He put this under administration and finance. He said, I'm not going to go fight with some bureau of government that's going to think they're worried about losing money 5 years from now. It's like the money, administration and finance runs the money, is where we're putting it. The concept of the trust fund set up the legality for a contract that is multiple year, that survives different governors and legislative lifts. There is actually no money in the trust fund. It allows for up to $50 million. It sets the legal bar, and they created a sinking fund in the event the government would like to set success payments aside as they go along. They don't have to, they can wait till the bill comes due. So I think that was a really critical piece for the government. The last thing I just want to say, so we transition here. For us, the business negotiations were great. We've been working really hard. We run on metrics. The more they got into business negotiations and the less we got into the weeds of bureaucracy, the better off we did in the negotiations. So in a funny way, people thought Goldman Sachs was the toughest partner for us, and I would tell you it was the easiest. Because in a funny way, we had more in common, although we don't have that kind of money. Okay, I'll be quiet now and see if you have questions.
So we were being asked in the Pay for Success program to greatly grow their impact in the number of young men who are in the program, and there's one whole side of the work and the organization that people are talking about is hiring and training staff and recognizing the challenges for opportunities for successes around scaling it. Sure, we can't rely on the same 10 people who are wonderful and amazing to take on
And they are
sometimes the
wonderful
caseload.
and
Exactly.
So we had grown already. We had already replicated ourselves once in Springfield. And we've had different growth sizes over the years. Parallel to this process, and we have had some more growth. We've opened in Boston. We've had to staff up our capacity to some degree. But parallel to this, traditional funding sources, private foundations, government money has been going down. So there's growth and there isn't. I mean, we're going to serve more young people in the end, but in a little bit, it was a little bit of this provided a different source. So we very carefully track the growth. But we're growing. Springfield has doubled in size, and the Western Mass Project's doing really well. We've opened in Boston. The Chelsea site, which serves 10 communities, actually is smaller. So it kind of goes like this, but it will get bigger. But we have the data. We have a very clear theory of change. We use data to really tell if we're on track or off track, because it's not about the numbers, right? It's about each one of these precious young people, even when they're challenging. But the data tells us if we're on track or off track. Like you send your kids to schools and you look at their report cards. You look at how the school is ranked and how they're doing, right? Those things help us. We have a really intensive training program. People get individual supervision. They have to pull data from the system. We have extensive crisis management, capacity. So we kind of spent a lot of time doing that. But it was a step up, so that's fair. It's kind of both. But it wasn't like this. It wasn't a straight up. And as I said earlier, we shouldn't have been surprised. I think originally we thought we'd have up to 400 young men in the first year. It was 300. It was a slow start because the data stuff was so hard to navigate, right? So that kind of helped. We had a little practice room there and coaching time in there a little bit. You
Go ahead, Dave, question.
Molly, what would be a grand slam home run, 5 year, if this happens and you're on the right end of the curve and all you do is it going to change the politics around this issue ultimately, or is it we do another one but we do it bigger?
I think it changes the politics and the players. This forces us to get better every day, right? We've already impacted government. It's interesting in the transition to the new Governor Baker, the fortune of being on a transition team, and everybody's talking about government transparency and outcomes and data, and I sort of, so look, you take Roca out of it, it's not a self-interest. I mean, I have self-interest, I'm not foolish, but take the self-interest out for a minute. I'm like, we did just spend all this time with 4 branches of government and 9 institutions on data and sharing. So it's already started to cause some changes. Our biggest partner is probation, and that rapport and those relationships, and we're impacting each other is huge. I think that's the home run. Can we in fact do more of the things that work? Somebody was talking earlier about government, government should do this. Unfortunately, governments aren't built for innovation. They haven't set themselves up on outcomes. There are a few places that are starting to. Kash was talking earlier, the government really needs some disruptive things to kick it into gear. There are all kinds of politics about how money's given out, right? People, I get people who are like, oh yeah, all the government grants are outcomes. And I'm like, other than pay for success, I haven't seen one. We've had a fair number of state and federal outcomes. They're really outputs, right? They're not about outcomes, so they need these kinds of things. So I think that's the, and obviously, really having more young men not dying out of prison.
You mentioned 300 a couple of times, that you started slower with 300 young men instead of 400.
Well, they came in every month.
Doesn't that hurt your, I mean, you've done well despite that, because I would think that hurts the numbers. If you were geared up to staff it for 400, you'd have more day, if you were successful. Do you think that, I'm just asking as a practical matter, was that a problem?
Well, so we geared up, then we threw the brakes on the gear up. And we had to kind of do some internal negotiation with the government to get us here, because we just, like, you go tell us to do this, and now it's you who aren't ready, right?
25%.
But we, we caught ourselves, and there was a little work in there. There was a little work in there.
Question here, talking about outcomes, I guess, could you talk a bit about how the estimate for the savings was derived, and which were maybe some of the more contentious assumptions when you were trying to get through that process? I guess, for example,
I'll do the best I can. I'm
yeah,
probably
for example,
the dullest pencil in the group for this.
I was just wondering, like, when you reach only 300 plus use instead of the original 400, but maybe even though the percentage reduction may be lower, but those 300 may be actually stickier because they have more time with that relationship, the person that they have the relationship with. So that could be a unforeseen benefit, even though the metric that you're being
Okay, so
measured
let's separate things. Our program, no matter what, is 4 years, 2-year intensive, 2-year follow-up, doesn't matter. The idea of this was a 7-year contract to serve 929 young men. There's all these math about randomized control and what gives you enough benefit of the control group versus a non-control group, and I'll stop there. We've got to have somebody else answer the rest of that. What we ended up doing was amending the contract, so the contract goes a little bit longer. The intention is still to get to 929. The simple version of the break even is just math. If people usually go back at 65% and we get them, we reduce that by 40%, then we're to break even. That's just a math number, right? And then if we look at, there's a little bit of, if we get to this point, we start saving the government after 40% a lot of money, and there's an end point on the paybacks because the government set aside $27 million from the state. There is a potential of an additional $11.67 million from some federal dollars, assuming things go well, which would add another 400 to the young people. What Roca did, my very bright colleague, first of all, it's just what does it cost to serve these young people, and you got to assume at what rate they're coming in. We looked at historical attrition rates, we're very conservative. We went back and looked at 900 young people that we think meet the high-risk criteria. Again, full disclosure, we did not have access to administrative data at that point. And looked at who went to prison and did some estimates on that, and we dialed that into the equation, right? What's great is this project, the random control trial, lets us really do another level of proof of concept that we wouldn't get otherwise. It's a little hard to do, and there's some real moral issues otherwise. And secondly, we have an agreement that our independent evaluator can access without names the administrative data. So we can do some work with that, so that's huge. So the payment thing also, so there are, I can't even remember the numbers, there are like multiple sheets behind this. I'm really gonna give you the high-level simple version, sorry, but that's what you got today. The payments are modeled based on the amount of reduction of incarceration. So marginal cost for incarceration in Massachusetts is $12,410, average cost is $47,500. So if we reduce incarceration by some low amount of X, we're gonna get paid back at the $12,410 mark. Then they picked a Y number, something in the middle, some other mark. And then if we can get to this point, if when in theory you could close a wing or a prison or avert future incarceration, then they'll pay average cost. So this is, I will say this is a very rigorously modeled project. The thing about using administrative data in theory, I don't know if it works in reality, if we have sentencing reform in theory, it should affect the group we treat as well as the group we don't treat. You know, if the economy changes. You have to forgive me for saying this because I'm not the pure evaluator, but nothing's perfect. I think this is a pretty rigorous project. We obviously studied the ones that went before us. We've taken a look at what's coming after us. This is a really rigorous project. So there's all kinds of things that trigger different responses. So I hope that gives you some of it. I mean, there are far brighter people and 8 million spreadsheets that but I couldn't do that. You keep going.
Yeah, let's take a question from you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you said it's a 4-year model. How do you come with a 4-year? And who decides that? Is it the government or the ROCA itself?
Oh, it's a ROCA model.
Okay.
We applied, we put ROCA in. We didn't change the model, so that's another interesting capacity issue. There's some places where people are creating something to do that. God bless them. They're braver than I mean, we really went in on the ROCA model. Our data has showed us, we used to say stay forever until you get better, change your life. That wasn't working so well, right? And a little structure there. Then we thought, okay, 4-year intensive and then follow-up, and then 3-year intensive, where our data showed that after 2 years, they're really diminishing returns. Young people were not only relapsing, they were regressing. So we back off the intensity, but we can't totally go away because this group, it's a bad example, but I don't really know what else to use. They're not even in the margins. Like, we gotta get them in the margins, right? Can we get them to the starting line and over the starting line, right? So they don't have the support network, so they need us around. So our data kind of showed how long that model should go, so we decided that. And the thing is all modeled economically at different price points, given the amount of intensity and follow-up.
Yeah, your question.
Curious what you've learned and what you could share with other nonprofit founders especially, but also the organizations generally, as they get ready for this kind of complexity in terms of structures, in terms of activity. What kind of founders are really ready to do this, nonprofit founders in particular?
So I don't know, founder, I don't know that I would think about it that way.
Yeah.
I think if you have an organization that has a very clear theory of change, you're very clear on what you're doing, you have used performance-based management, you may already, there are a few, there aren't a lot. There are a handful of programs that have done what they call the gold bar random control trial. Very, very few, it's hard to do. But so if you know that, you're in much better shape. Nurse Family Partnership, for example, is one of the CIBs in the South, and I think somewhere else in the country. If you haven't used data and you're not getting regular outcomes over time and you can't sort of say you're doing the same thing, I wouldn't get near it. People have, you can imagine, this thing like took our profile like out of control. We're some big deal. And I'm like, yeah, we're really the same crumbs we were before we got this thing. And people are calling us up and you have to tell us how to do it and how do you do it and how do you do a SIB. And people who hated us are calling us. It's fascinating. I like this doing here. But, and recently is a fabulous friend we have through some contacts, almost like family in the world, given how we know each other. And they're like insisting that doing the ROCA model out of the country somewhere, and I'm like, you can't come then. You're our friend and we love you. You are not ready. You have never done this. You do what you want to do, but you can't come here and take half of this. This is not 3 CDs and a manual, and you two can do this. So I think you just have to be ready, right? And I completely understand it. Part of the challenge of nonprofits, there's all the work and the privilege of being with people and helping them make changes. That's one whole thing. And then there's a money thing, and they don't usually relate, right? It's almost like a separate business. So if you're not clear on what you're doing and you can't show it, you don't have the track record. You know, we tell people, my other colleague who does all the financing part, people call us all the time, we're like, don't do it. Some people listen, some don't, but anyway, that's what I would say.
So just to pick up from where Molly left off, there are only about 7 PFS contracts signed in the US over the last 2 years. So it's very, very hard. So to answer your question, it's not an easy thing. So often people talk about pay for success, social impact bond. There are $43 trillion under management in the US. So why can't we bring these $43 trillion to issues like this? All that is a lot of hype. Because in order to do this, as you found out from what Molly said and through a little bit of the discussion, you need an outstanding organization on the ground who can actually deal with these social issues, have the data to show that they can deliver performance, and that performance has to translate into government savings. And even for a well-executed contract like the Massachusetts PFS for juvenile recidivism, the data exists in 4 different departments. It's very, very hard to get all these pieces together. In fact, the first few contracts were all on recidivism. New York City had a contract, New York State had a contract, Massachusetts had a contract. It's all on recidivism where you can pinpoint. And then the mother of all contracts, the Peterborough prison, which is where it started, was also on prison recidivism. The first 4 were all on recidivism. Then I think we broke away from it. Chicago has a contract on education, early childhood education. Salt Lake County has a contract on early childhood education. That's a little harder to pin down because the savings comes over a very, very long period of time. So you've got to have intermediate measures of performance. You can't really pin it down to how many lives saved, more like what is the reading level, what are the scores, intermediate level. So only 7 contracts have been done. Roughly about $77 million worth of PFSs have been issued. There are another 20 that are being negotiated, like the one that Molly already mentioned. Nurse Family Partners, there are a couple more, Santa Clara County, some on healthcare. So all that stuff, if it all materializes, might reach about $300 million.
And as you were talking about alternatives, like the homelessness one for Massachusetts just got signed, right? And it ends up that most of the savings was in federal dollars and not in state dollars. So they only needed a little bit of the money from the state dollars. But they were able over the year that they were, the second year of negotiating, because we all negotiated for 18 months, and then they did another. They restructured all kinds of homelessness and put different money together. So they did some other things with it. So this idea of, you know, some people are in love with this thing because they think it's an alternative way to make money and good investing for free, you know, whatever. Some people want to drive government transparency. I think that's awesome, right? You know, some people, you know, get better outcomes. But if you can use it to start to do one-offs on more creative things so we can actually help people who are really vulnerable and struggling in a much different way, I think that's cool too. I mean, you know.
And put a spotlight on performance. I think what this has really done is if we think that private sector money is going to flow in, I think we'll be disappointed. The money, a lot of money that's flowing in is really philanthropic money that's flowing in. But what it really does is it puts the spotlight on performance. That's what it really does. That's where the real transformation will come, where a lot of organizations will rise up and start looking at performance measures. So it will definitely have a transformative impact. Things will change, but a lot of people will try to do like what Roca has done, or Frontline has done in Cleveland, or CEO has done in New York. These are the organizations that will surface and become the role models. We're already at 1:45. So Molly, you will have the last word, and then we will hand it back to the organizers. Any last parting thoughts for any?
Thank you very much.
So we want to give you a big hand.
We'd like to thank Professor Rangan and Molly profusely for this entire discussion, and on our behalf, on behalf of the SECON team, give us more to for you.
Thank you so much.